Hello, this is the video for Chapter 29 on Conservative America from 1980 to 1991. Our essential question is, what factors made the rise of the new right possible? And what ideas about freedom and citizenship did conservatives articulate in the 1980s? So the first thing we need to do is find out who this new right is, and that's going to first take place in finding out who these people became, or who were they before they were the new right. In the 1960s, a famous conservative was a man named Barry Goldwater. He would run for president in 1964, but would eventually lose. But he would gain a lot of national prominence for his focus on limited government and personal freedom, meaning he doesn't want the national government to get involved with individual freedoms or with state power. So he doesn't like the New Deal government. He doesn't like the national government getting involved with civil rights issues in states. He wants to be more aggressive against communism. But at that time, politicians were more moderate, and Barry Goldwater is seen as more of an extremist. And so after he loses the election in 1964, he kind of falls out of popularity. And eventually a lot of his supporters would turn in the 1970s to Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan had similar tenets to Barry Goldwater. He was very anti-communist. He believed in free market economics, and he relied on religious traditionalism. So he's very anti-communist. He's been that way for a long time, and we'll see how he shows that in his presidency. He also believes in free market economics, which means he wants to have limited government involvement in businesses, so not very many rules or regulations against businesses. That's called laissez-faire economics. He would also get a lot of support from religious conservatives in the 1970s and 80s. Before this time period, religious leaders in the evangelical church really didn't get involved with politics very much. They kind of stayed out of that. But in the 1970s and 80s, religious leaders started to turn to politics as a way to get support for their ideological or religious beliefs in the government. So in many evangelical circles, they condemned divorce and abortion, premarital sex, and feminism, and pushed for the government to follow those same ideas. In our last chapter, chapter 28, I believe, we talked about how President Carter is elected into the presidency. So this is a little bit about his presidency itself. There's some foreign policy issues surrounding human rights. There's a couple of foreign policy issues that we should know. One is the Camp David Accords, where he got Egypt and Israel to come together and strike some kind of peace agreement. That's not very long lasting, but with the very difficult relationship between Egypt and Israel, this was seen as an important victory. And then after some conflict between the United States and Russia, Russia invaded the country of Afghanistan, tried to take it over, and America ended up giving money and supplies to rebels in Afghanistan, including young rebels like a man named Osama bin Laden. Here you can see Carter brokering the peace deal between Egypt and Israel. But the biggest foreign policy issue facing Carter's presidency is what's happening in Iran. For a long time, Iran has been controlled by a pro-United States leader named Mohammad Pahlavi. However, in the 1970s, Iran went through a religious revolution that drove Pahlavi from power. Pahlavi left the country of Iran and went to the United States for safety, for fear that he would be killed, and also because he is he's getting cancer and he is going to the United States for treatment. And so Iran wants the United States to give Pahlavi back to Iran. The United States says no. And so so citizens in Iran stormed the US embassy and took some Americans who were working there as hostages. And so the hostages were kept in Iran for many, many days. And this was seen as a very difficult and a failure for Carter, that he wasn't able to get the hostages out. Iran would eventually release the hostages the day after Carter was done being president. Okay. And this is a very strange and disturbing cartoon. Uncle Sam apparently wants to fight Iranians because of the hostages. So with the hostage situation and with the economic issues in the 1970s that we talked about in our previous chapter, Carter's approval rating dropped significantly. There's high unemployment, high inflation, and with the failure of the hostage situation, Carter was not going to win the presidency in 1980, and instead Ronald Reagan would win in a landslide. So Ronald Reagan is able to get a new, what's called a coalition. That just means who's voting for them. Some people who have been Republican for a while stayed. White, rich Protestant Americans continued to be Republicans, but also a beginning of change. People living in suburbs began to vote Republicans. Many Southern whites who traditionally had voted for Democrats now switched to vote for Reagan because the Democrats were supporting civil rights. And when Ronald Reagan comes into office, he wants to limit how big the government is. And so he wants to have fewer taxes. He wants the government to spend less money on welfare programs. That's programs for the poor. And he wants to get rid of regulations against businesses. For the tax side, this is known as supply side economics or Reaganomics. And so that's where the government reduces the amount of taxes that need to be paid by businesses and the rich. And the idea is that the businesses and rich would take that money that they save and then go and invest that into more factories, more workers, better wages for their workers. More people would get jobs, more people would be able to buy stuff. This is called trickle-down economics. So it's the idea that helping the rich now will eventually help the poor. This is a very controversial aspect. Ronald Reagan's budget director even argued that it's not really based on any science or anything. It's just kind of, we hope this happens. More research has been done since then. And I think it was just about a month ago, research was done on trickle-down economics and found that it doesn't actually do anything. The rich and businesses usually just take that money and reinvest it in themselves instead of helping the poor. And so this means that our debt is going to increase dramatically. We're going to owe a lot of money because taxes on the rich and businesses increase or decrease. So taxes is huge under Reagan's policy, but also the idea that regulations or rules against businesses also hurt businesses. And so Reagan continues the trend of deregulation. And so he'd go after or government organizations like OSHA that protects workers, or the EPA that protects the environment, and basically cuts their budget so that they are able to do less work. Or what you could do is you could take an organization like the Department of the Interior that's in charge of national forests and protecting land and everything, and put somebody in there who doesn't care about the environment, doesn't care about forests, and then they're not going to protect that land. So that's one thing that you can do if you don't like what a government agency does. Put somebody in there that doesn't like it either, and then they'll do not what the organization is supposed to do. Ronald Reagan was able to appoint the first female justice of the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor. But even by putting her in the court and two others, the Supreme Court did not turn more conservative after this. The hope under Reagan was that new justices would overturn controversial issues decided in the 1960s and 70s, like abortion and affirmative action, but they would not be overturned. Another social or medical failure of the 1980s under Reagan was a slow response to the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Early on, it especially would affect gay men and would kill over 100,000 Americans throughout the 1980s. It took 8 years, it took his last year in office for Ronald Reagan to get the government to spend any money on research or treatment of the disease. In 1984, Ronald Reagan wins another landslide. You can see that in this map. And in this time period, businesses are growing dramatically. But factories are not. So the service economy is growing, financial, medical services, computer technology, those are all growing in the United States, but factories actually make the stuff are decreasing. Instead, other countries like Japan and West Germany are growing their control over factory productions, and more businesses are beginning to outsource to other countries. And with more service industries like financial and medical services becoming bigger and more important, people who are successful in those industries also become popularized, like the movie Wall Street, all about investment traders, and Donald Trump in the 1980s. Businesses are in the United States that are more service-based are also going to be growing in this time period because of new technology like computers that would also make it to homes in the form of a personal computer. Now, for about 15 years, the United States, or actually, I should say about 10 years, um, the United States has had a détente with Russia where they kind of lessen tensions and not fight as much. Instead, when Ronald Reagan becomes president, he does not want to just calmly wait for the Cold War to end. He wants to defeat communism outright. And so he wants to spend more money on defense, more nuclear weapons. There's even a plan to create a strategic defense initiative where they create these new satellites. You can see it in this picture here that would float around the United States. And if a nuclear bomb was coming to hit the US, it would shoot a laser beam through space and hit the nuclear bomb and blow it up. It was never actually built, but it shows Reagan's determination and willingness to spend a whole lot of money on defense. One of Ronald Reagan's worst foreign policy error was something called the Iran-Contra affair. So again, in the 1980s, some Americans were held hostage in Iran, not by the government, but by some terrorists. The United States asked them for help, and Iran said, "We will help you, but you have to give us weapons first." So we sold weapons to Iran, and the plan was to take that extra money that we just got and to go down to Nicaragua, who had a democratically elected leader, but who was communist. And so, the United States wanted to take that money and train a group of Nicaraguan rebels called the Contras to go in and overthrow this democratically elected government because it was more communist. Congress found out about the plan and they made a law saying they couldn't do it, but members of Reagan's administration went through it anyway. So even though this was illegal, Ronald Reagan was asked, like, when did he know about it? How much did he know about it? And either he knew about it and lied, which is obviously bad, or he didn't know about it and people in his presidency were able to do things without him knowing, which is also bad. Now, Russia in itself has had a lot of industrial problems. Their factories, especially later on, have become much more inefficient. They put way more money in space and military industries and not enough in other factories. And so their factories were not ready to meet this new global economy that the world was entering into. And so the new leader of Russia, his name is Mikhail Gorbachev, met with Ronald Reagan, and they basically led a new détente. And so they, as Gorbachev is lessening tensions, the countries that they had taken over during the Cold War period, like Estonia and Latvia and Ukraine and Belarus, decided to become independent in what was called the Velvet Revolution. And by 1991, the Soviet Union dissolves. Russia is just Russia now. And the Berlin Wall fell about 2 years earlier in Germany. And so in 1988, Ronald Reagan's vice president, George H.W. Bush, runs for president and wins in a major victory. And so now with Russia gone and the Cold War over, the United States has this huge military, and they need to figure out what they're going to do with it. There's lots of conflicts around the world. Does the United States get involved when another country has a conflict? At what point do we get involved? Because countries always have conflicts. When do we get involved? When do we send soldiers? At what point does that happen? And so we're going to see that for the next 20 or so years, the Middle East is going to be the main concern for America's foreign policy during this time period. The conflict over Israel and the rest of the Middle East is very difficult, especially when the United States supports Israel. And in 1990, when Iraq invades a small, wealthy neighbor, but also an ally of the United States, a country called Kuwait, the United States goes in and invades. This first Persian Gulf War is a very short fight, but a victory. The United States said, okay, we're going to leave. We're not going to stay in Iraq. And Saddam Hussein, you can stay in power, but don't do anything like this again. We'll see if that happens. Okay, that is it for this PowerPoint slide. If you have any questions, just email your teacher. Thank you.